It was a clear, crisp October morning in the quiet suburb of Willow Creek, the kind where the air felt sharper and the leaves along the sidewalks were scattered in neat piles from the early morning wind. 14-year-old Emma Caldwell sat in the passenger seat of her mother's sedan, her backpack strapped snugly to her shoulders. Laura Caldwell, like most mornings, parked at the curb in front of Willow Creek Middle School. Their routine was always the same. Laura would lean slightly toward her daughter, offering a quick smile, and Emma would return it before stepping out into the brisk air. Witnesses later remembered that morning being perfectly ordinary, the kind of uneventful start no one would think twice about. At exactly 7:42 a.m., the school's front security camera captured Emma walking across the short stretch of pavement toward the double-glass doors. She was dressed in her favorite maroon hoodie, her hair loose over her shoulders, a few strands falling into her face as she glanced down at something in her hand, possibly her phone. The timestamp was crisp and clear. Yet when investigators would later comb through the interior security footage, something strange stood out. There was no sign of Emma entering the building, no second angle catching her stepping into the hallway, no camera showing her stowing her backpack in her locker. It was as if she had walked toward the doors and then disappeared in the few feet between the sidewalk and the school interior. By the time the morning classes had started, Laura was already on her way to work. She had no reason to suspect anything was wrong until 2:18 p.m. when her phone rang. The caller ID displayed the school's number. Expecting something minor, perhaps an update about an assignment or a forgotten form, she answered casually. On the other end, the school secretary's voice was tight, hesitant. She asked if Laura knew why Emma hadn't attended any classes that day. Laura's first reaction was confusion, certain there had been some mix-up. She explained she'd dropped Emma off that morning, just like always. But the secretary confirmed the attendance logs. Emma had been marked absent for every period. Panic began to bloom in the pit of Laura's stomach. She left work immediately, driving the short distance back to the school, rehearsing rational explanations in her head. Emma had felt unwell and gone home. She'd met a friend and skipped class. She'd misunderstood something about the schedule. But when Laura arrived, her daughter's friends were just as bewildered. None of them had seen her that morning. The school principal called in the resource officer stationed on campus. A quick sweep of the building turned up nothing. Emma's locker was untouched, the books she had left the day before still neatly stacked inside. Her coat remained on its hook, untouched. The officer checked the cafeteria, the gym, even the restrooms. No trace. They expanded their search to the 80 school grounds, walking the perimeter, checking behind the dumpsters, scanning the athletic fields. The area was open and well kept, the kind of place where there were few spots to hide. It made the absence all the more alarming. By 4 p.m., the Willow Creek Police Department had been contacted. Missing person cases for minors triggered an immediate response. Officers canvassed the surrounding neighborhood, stopping at convenience stores and gas stations within a 3-block radius, asking if anyone had seen a girl matching Emma's description. They checked nearby bus stops, fearing she might have boarded public transport. Nothing. One of the first official steps was to review security footage from the exterior cameras. That was when the grainy image of Emma walking toward the school came to light. She was there at 7:42 a.m., walking with the easy stride of someone in no rush, both straps of her backpack secure, her gaze lowered toward her phone. The footage ended just before she reached the doors. The next camera, inside the entryway, picked up students entering moments later, but Emma wasn't among them. She had vanished in a blind spot of less than 20 feet. It was an odd detail, one that could be explained away by a sudden change of mind. Perhaps she had turned back before entering, gone down the side of the building toward the street. But for Laura, that explanation made no sense. Emma had never skipped school before, never shown signs of rebellion or secrecy. She was a responsible, bright teenager who lived in a home without conflict. She had plans that day, after-school activities she looked forward to. Nothing about her life suggested she would simply walk away. As daylight faded, the search widened. Officers moved door to door, showing Emma's photo, describing her last known outfit. A K-9 unit was brought in, starting at the school's entrance. The dog picked up her scent briefly, but lost it quickly on the north side of the property, near a small side street used mainly for deliveries and staff parking. That detail would lodge itself in the back of the lead investigator's mind. By evening, Laura sat in a small windowless interview room at the police station. They asked her to recount the morning in exact detail: what time they left the house, what Emma had said, if anything seemed unusual in her mood. Laura answered each question with the same refrain. It had been completely normal. When asked if Emma had been in contact with anyone suspicious, Laura shook her head, but a flicker of doubt crossed her face. She admitted Emma had been more absorbed in her phone lately, though she'd chalked it up to friends and schoolwork. The official missing person bulletin went out that night, Emma's school photo broadcast on local news stations. Police described her as 5'4", with brown hair and hazel eyes, last seen wearing a maroon hoodie, dark jeans, and sneakers. Viewers were urged to call a tip line with any information. But behind the urgency, there was a chilling undercurrent. Emma hadn't just gone missing somewhere in town. She had vanished from a place surrounded by people, cameras, and routine, and somehow no one saw where she went. For Laura, the drive home that night felt unreal. Every intersection, every sidewalk seemed like it could hide an answer. Somewhere between the moment Emma stepped out of her car and the moment she should have stepped inside the school, her daughter had entered an entirely different reality, and Laura had no idea how to reach her. And as police replayed that short clip of Emma walking toward the school doors, one small, unsettling detail began to emerge, something in her body language that hinted she might not have been heading inside at all. The morning after Emma's disappearance, investigators began expanding their search radius beyond the school property. Patrol units were sent into the surrounding blocks, questioning shop owners, pedestrians, and residents who might have been out early. At the same time, detectives collected surveillance footage from any business with exterior cameras. They worked backward and forward from the school's timestamp, trying to account for every step Emma might have taken once she was last seen approaching the front doors. It was during this sweep that they found something: a grainy recording from a hardware store camera located 2 blocks from the school. The footage showed a figure, small in stature, wearing what appeared to be a maroon hoodie, walking steadily down a narrow side street that branched away from the main school entrance. The timestamp read 7:47 a.m., just 5 minutes after she'd been dropped off. The discovery altered the tone of the investigation. This was not a case of a teenager disappearing inside the school. She had deliberately, or perhaps under someone's influence, left the immediate area. The street she was on was quieter, lined with small warehouses and delivery entrances, a route most students had no reason to take. Detectives canvassed the area, hoping to spot her on other cameras. They found 2 more clips, one from a laundromat and another from a liquor store, that seemed to capture the same figure from a distance. In the second clip, the girl's head was turned, speaking to someone just out of frame. Then came the witness statements. A delivery driver, on his way to drop off a shipment at a cafe, reported seeing a teenage girl matching Emma's description standing near a white panel van parked at the curb. She was speaking to a man he described as middle-aged, wearing a baseball cap and dark jacket. The driver said the conversation didn't appear confrontational, but the detail that unsettled investigators was the van. It had no visible markings, no company logo, nothing to suggest it belonged there for legitimate business. Another witness, a woman walking her dog, confirmed she'd seen the same pair, adding that the man seemed to gesture toward the van as if inviting the girl closer. When police asked Laura about the possibility of Emma knowing someone like that, she shook her head firmly. Emma didn't have older male friends, and she wasn't the kind of girl to strike up conversations with strangers. Laura had monitored her daughter's social circle closely, or so she thought. Detectives, however, quietly began to explore a darker theory, that Emma had been in contact with someone online, someone she trusted enough to meet in person. They obtained a warrant for Emma's phone and computer data, but the process was slow. By the time they gained access, the trail was already cooling. There were fragments of online chats, but nothing clearly incriminating, just vague references to meeting someone near school. The contact appeared to be linked to a prepaid number that had been activated only a week earlier and was now disconnected. No name, no address, no subscriber information. The panel van became the investigation's central focus. Officers checked traffic cameras at major intersections in hopes of catching it leaving the area. They scoured motor vehicle records for white vans registered locally. But the description was too generic. There were hundreds in the county alone. Without a license plate, the search was like chasing a shadow. For Laura, the news about the van felt like both a lead and a blow. It gave shape to the possibility that her daughter had been coerced, but it also planted an image she couldn't erase. Emma, standing on a street corner in the cold morning air, speaking to a stranger who might have taken her away in an instant. Every time Laura closed her eyes, she saw that van driving off. As days turned into weeks, the white van lead fizzled. Tips came in from as far as 2 states away, sightings of vans in parking lots, near schools, on highways, but each one was checked and ruled out. Some belonged to electricians or plumbers, others were delivery vehicles with legitimate work orders for the day Emma vanished. The original witnesses couldn't provide enough detail to distinguish the exact vehicle from the countless others on the road. Unable to accept that the trail had gone cold, Laura began her own search. She retraced Emma's last known path, walking the side street over and over, studying every doorway and alley. She spoke to shop owners the police had already interviewed, hoping someone might remember a detail they hadn't thought important at the time, a license plate fragment, a sound, a smell, anything. She started keeping a notebook, filling its pages with street maps, descriptions of vehicles she saw near the area, and names of people who had been on that street that morning. Friends and family worried she was chasing ghosts, but Laura couldn't shake the belief that the answers were still out there, waiting to be found. She began to watch the grainy surveillance footage on her own computer at night, pausing and replaying every frame, searching for some movement or gesture she'd missed before. Sometimes she thought she saw Emma glance over her shoulder, as if sensing she was being followed. Other times, she convinced herself the figure's stride seemed too casual for someone in danger. The uncertainty was crushing, but it also fueled her. She couldn't stop, because if Emma had been taken by someone in that van, then somewhere, out there on some forgotten street, that man still existed. And Laura believed he might still have her daughter. By the second week, the momentum of the search for Emma Caldwell had shifted. In the first few days, the town had moved like a single organism. Neighbors opening their doors to officers, strangers combing through brush along creek beds, volunteer groups tacking her photo to every light pole and storefront. But as the days passed without a single credible lead, the urgency began to thin into something heavier, the quiet weight of not knowing. Search teams, often made up of both trained personnel and locals, pushed deeper into wooded trails on the outskirts of town, combing every path with methodical precision. The riverbanks were walked in slow, deliberate steps, eyes scanning for any scrap of clothing or personal item. Abandoned barns and unused storage sheds were entered one by one, the stale air inside thick with the smell of dust and mildew, each time yielding nothing. Volunteer coordinators began mapping the search zones with red marker lines to show where had already been cleared. Each completed section, instead of bringing relief, only deepened the unease. It meant another place Emma wasn't. Her photo, printed in hundreds of copies, was posted in towns miles away, taped to gas station windows and pinned to bulletin boards at diners. The smiling school portrait became a silent presence in places Emma had likely never been, a face that strangers now carried in their minds, scanning crowds for a chance recognition. The tips still came in, dozens a day, but nearly all were dead ends. Some claimed to have seen a girl in a hoodie boarding a bus. Others described spotting someone who looked like her in a mall food court. Each report sent detectives out, sometimes across county lines, only for them to return with the same answer. It wasn't Emma. Even the more hopeful sightings fell apart quickly under scrutiny. Security footage would show someone shorter, older, or with a different gait entirely. Every promising thread unraveled within hours, leaving the investigators back where they started. The small investigative team, now spread thin, turned back to the digital trail, hoping technology might reveal what physical searches could not. They subpoenaed Emma's phone records and began reconstructing her activity from the moment she left Laura's car. Her location data had stopped transmitting around the time she was last seen walking down the side street, suggesting the phone had been switched off or destroyed. But one detail stood out. At 8:14 a.m., less than half an hour after she had been dropped off, Emma had sent a text message to a number police didn't recognize. The message itself was short, and for now, detectives kept its contents from the public. The number belonged to a prepaid cell phone purchased days before her disappearance. It had no registered owner, and the carrier could only confirm it had been activated in a different county. By the time investigators traced the signal's last known location, it was gone, either powered off permanently or discarded. It was a dead end in the truest sense. For Laura, learning about that final text was like being given a door she could never open. She asked detectives what it said, but they told her they couldn't release that information while the case was active. She pressed anyway, convinced that whatever Emma had written might explain everything, but the answer never came. Instead, Laura was left with the knowledge that her daughter had reached out to someone she didn't recognize, and that whoever it was had vanished just as completely as Emma. The atmosphere around the case grew quieter, more brittle. The daily briefings stopped. Reporters who had once camped outside the police station moved on to other stories. The flyers stayed up, but their edges curled in the wind, the ink fading under the autumn sun. For Laura, every morning was another reminder that the world was continuing without her daughter in it. She stopped sleeping through the night, waking to check her phone in case she'd missed a call. Each time, the screen was blank. Officers continued to work the case, but the reality was impossible to ignore. Without new evidence, the investigation was stalling. Theories began to multiply in whispers that Emma had been abducted and taken far beyond the reach of local search teams, that she had met someone online and ran away willingly, or that something far worse had happened in those missing minutes between the school drop-off or walk down that side street. None of the possibilities brought comfort. Laura began to feel as though she was watching doors close in front of her one by one. First, the school, then the van, then the phone records. Each lead seemed to dissolve into nothing. She kept replaying the morning in her head, searching for some small detail she had missed, something she could give the investigators that would shift the trajectory of the search. But the truth was, there was nothing more to give. By the end of the second week, the official line from police was that they were following all leads, though privately they admitted to one another that they had no direction left. For Laura, the silence was its own kind of torment, because somewhere out there, that phone had rung, that text had been read, and whoever had seen it might be the only person who knew where Emma had gone. And if they were still out there, they weren't talking. It had been nearly a full year since Emma Caldwell vanished, and the case had settled into the kind of haunting quiet that follows a storm. The town had long since returned to its routines. The flyers had mostly disappeared from windows, and police updates had dwindled to the occasional reminder that the investigation was still open and active. For Laura, the days blurred together. Endless mornings of waking to the same hollow absence, endless nights replaying the drop-off in her mind. She'd stopped expecting the phone to ring with news. So when an unfamiliar message appeared in her inbox late one evening, her first reaction was disbelief. The sender claimed to be from another state and said they had been browsing a live-streamed video chat site when they saw a girl who looked exactly like Emma. The girl had been on for only a few minutes, sitting in a small, dimly lit room. According to the stranger, her expression was tense, her posture guarded. She seemed to glance off screen repeatedly, as if someone else was there. The witness swore the resemblance was uncanny. The same hazel eyes, the same maroon hoodie, though the lighting had made it hard to be certain. The message ended with an apology for not being able to record the stream in time. Laura's pulse raced as she read it again and again. After a year of silence, this was the first unsolicited lead that felt different. She forwarded it to the detective still assigned to the case, and within hours the department's cybercrimes unit was involved. They contacted the hosting site, requesting access to any archived footage or logs that might identify the stream's origin. The answer came quickly and without ceremony. The stream had not been saved, and the hosting company's servers automatically deleted unarchived sessions within 24 hours. Whatever had been broadcast was already gone. Detectives attempted to trace the account used for the stream, but it had been created only days before and deleted immediately afterward. The IP address pointed to a public Wi-Fi hotspot in another city, an anonymous signal lost in the noise of hundreds of daily users. It was another dead end, yet unlike the countless false sightings before it, this one lingered in Laura's mind. Experts were split. Some who saw the still images taken by the witness insisted the girl was a near-perfect match for Emma, noting subtle details in her facial structure and mannerisms. Others dismissed it as a look-alike, pointing out the grainy quality and the distortions caused by the poor lighting. The debate only deepened the torment. If it was her, she might be alive and reachable. If it wasn't, the hope it stirred would be nothing but another cruel detour. Laura found herself staring at the single screenshot the witness had managed to take, zooming in until the pixels broke apart. In the background, she thought she could make out a calendar on the wall, but the numbers were illegible. A shape in the corner. Might have been a chair, or it might have been a shadow. The more she looked, the less she could trust her own eyes. She began spending more and more time online, first searching for similar live stream platforms, then joining forums dedicated to tracking missing persons. At first, she was a quiet observer, reading threads where strangers discussed techniques for identifying locations from small clues. A street sign glimpsed through a window, the pattern of tiles on a floor, the make of a light fixture. Gradually, she started participating, posting Emma's case, sharing the image, and asking if anyone recognized the room. The responses came from all over. Theories about cheap motel layouts, comparisons to basement rentals, guesses based on the wall paint and furniture style. Before long, Laura's nights were consumed by this new routine. She scrolled through endless streams of images, vacation photos posted to social media, real estate listings, random snapshots tagged in distant cities, searching for anything that resembled the room in the screenshot. She learned to use reverse image searches to check photo metadata, to trace the origins of a post back through layers of reposts. It became an obsession. Meals went cold on the table as she pored over another batch of low-resolution pictures. She found herself zooming into background windows, checking if the skyline matched a place she'd already marked on her growing digital map. Friends noticed the change in her. Conversations with her often drifted back to the same topic, no matter how they began. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a desperate attempt to hold on to something that was already gone. But for Laura, this was the only way forward. The girl in that screenshot, whether Emma or not, had reignited something she thought she'd lost. And if it was her daughter, then somewhere out there, in some real and tangible place, that room existed. All she had to do was find it. It had been 18 months since Emma Caldwell's disappearance when a new piece of mail arrived at Laura's home. It was an unremarkable envelope, no return address, no markings besides her own name, and street written in uneven block letters. The paper was cheap, the kind you could buy in any drugstore, and there was nothing to suggest its contents before she slid a finger under the seal. Inside was a single sheet of printer paper, and on it, a grainy photograph. Laura's breath caught as her eyes fixed on the image. It showed a girl seated on a sun-bleached bench in what looked like the parking lot of a run-down gas station. The lot was cracked, weeds sprouting from the fissures in the pavement, and a faded sign hung loosely from its pole in the background. The girl's face was partially turned away, caught mid-gesture, as if she'd been speaking to someone just out of the frame. The resolution was poor, but her clothing was sharp enough to make Laura's chest tighten. It was a maroon hoodie, nearly identical to Emma's favorite, the one she'd worn on the day she vanished. Laura stared at it for long minutes before noticing the postmark. It was from a small town in another state, almost 500 miles away. She drove straight to the police station, clutching the photograph as if it might vanish if she loosened her grip. Detectives examined it carefully, noting the lack of identifying features around the gas station. No visible store name, no legible road signs. They ran the girl's image through facial recognition software, comparing it to Emma's school portraits and family photos. The result came back with a probability score too low to confirm and too high to dismiss. On the back of the photograph, written in faint ballpoint ink, was a single set of GPS coordinates, No explanation, no message, just numbers. Forensic technicians dusted the envelope and photo for prints, finding nothing usable. The paper carried no identifiable DNA trace, and the ink offered no leads. Whoever had sent it had taken steps to remain untraceable. The coordinates pointed to a remote stretch of highway on the outskirts of the town, listed in the postmark. Within hours, 2 detectives were on a plane, meeting local law enforcement on the ground. They drove to the location, a desolate roadside pull-off bordered by dry scrubland and scattered pines. The air was heavy with the smell of gasoline from a nearby truck stop. The spot was unremarkable, the kind of place where no one lingered unless they had a reason to. They canvassed the area, visiting every gas station within a 20-mile radius. At one small station, the manager recalled a girl in a maroon hoodie coming in with a man several weeks earlier. She was quiet, kept her head down, and paid cash for bottled water. But when shown the photograph, the manager hesitated and admitted they weren't certain. It could have been her, but it could have been someone else. The station's security cameras had been down that week, so there was no footage to confirm the sighting. The detectives expanded their search, stopping at motels, diners, and rest stops, asking questions, showing the image. No one could give them a definitive answer. Back at the coordinate site, they searched the scrubland for anything that might connect to Emma. Discarded clothing, personal items, any trace. But the ground offered nothing. The only sound was the occasional rumble of passing trucks. When the team returned home empty-handed, Laura was left with the photograph and the gnawing uncertainty it carried. She pinned it to a corkboard in her living room, among the maps and notes she'd been compiling since the day Emma vanished. She found herself studying it at odd hours, searching for details others might have overlooked. A blurred shape behind the bench could have been a trash can or a duffel bag. The slant of shadow suggested late afternoon, but the season was impossible to tell. To outsiders, it was just another in a string of false leads. But for Laura, it was more than that. Someone had taken the time to send it. Someone had written those coordinates. Whether it was meant to help or to taunt, she couldn't tell. But either way, it meant someone, somewhere, knew more than they were saying. And if they could send one picture, they could send another. Laura Caldwell had learned the rhythms of waiting. The long silences between police updates, the hollow reassurance in their voices when they said they were still working the case. After 18 months of chasing false hope, she stopped expecting breakthroughs to come from anyone else. The photograph from the anonymous letter had left her with more questions than answers, but it had also planted something new, a sense that there might be a pattern no one was seeing. If the police weren't going to connect the dots, she would. She began with a map pinned to the wall of her living room. Every tip, every reported sighting, every vague description of a maroon hoodie was marked with a colored pushpin. Soon, the map began to look like a scatter of stars, but Laura noticed something others had overlooked. Several pins, spanning 3 states, lined up along a major rural trucking route. The sightings weren't frequent, but they were consistent enough to catch her attention. They stretched from a rest stop 2 hours south of Willow Creek all the way to a fuel depot outside the town where the anonymous letter had been postmarked. On Friday nights, she would load her camera and a notebook into the passenger seat, fill her tank, and drive. Her weekends were spent pulling off the highway at motels with peeling paint, truck stops with humming fluorescent lights, and diners that smelled of burnt coffee. She photographed parking lots, storefronts, and the faces of strangers in hopes that one day, one of them would match something she'd seen in a tip or a piece of footage. Friends tried to intervene, telling her she was wearing herself down, that she was chasing shadows. But Laura had stopped listening to anyone who wasn't actively helping her find Emma. She didn't care if it seemed irrational. These stretches of highway might be where her daughter had been taken, where she might still be moved from place to place, hidden in plain sight among the transient faces of long-haul truckers and their passengers. Her marriage, already frayed by grief, began to buckle under the strain. Arguments grew sharper, the silences longer. Her husband wanted her to accept that they might never know what happened. Laura refused. One evening, he packed a bag and left without saying when, or if, he'd be back. She didn't stop him. By then, the search had consumed everything else in her life. When she wasn't on the road, Laura spent her nights poring over trucking schedules, learning which companies operated along the route she was tracking. She joined online communities where drivers swapped stories, scanning for any mention of a girl matching Emma's description. She built a mental map of rest stops that offered cheap showers, motels that accepted cash, diners that stayed open all night. Every detail mattered. The police knew about her efforts. At first, they tolerated them, even looked into a few of the places she flagged. But as time went on, their warnings grew more pointed. They told her that chasing unverified leads could interfere with the case, that she might alert the wrong person and make things worse. Laura listened politely, then went back to her planning. She couldn't understand how following the same dead ends over and over was any better than what she was doing. The highway became a second home. She learned the smell of diesel that hung in the air at certain rest areas, the way headlights stretched across the blacktop in the early hours before dawn. She spoke to clerks who barely looked up from their counters, to waitresses who had seen so many faces come and go that they barely remembered one from the next. Sometimes she thought she caught a flicker of recognition in someone's eyes when she showed them Emma's photo, but it was never enough to build on. Still, Laura kept going. Each mile was a thread in the web she was weaving, each conversation a small gamble that one day would pay off. She had started to believe that the answer wasn't in a single location or sighting, but in the spaces between them, the routes, the timing, the places where someone could pass through without leaving a trace. Her friends saw a woman wearing herself to nothing. Laura saw a mother refusing to let her daughter disappear into a statistic. And as the months passed, the line of pins on her map grew longer, edging ever closer to a point she hadn't yet reached. Somewhere along that road, she believed, Emma's trail was still warm. It was just a matter of finding the right mile to follow it. 2 years had passed since the morning Emma Caldwell vanished, and the official investigation had slipped into a quiet rhythm of cold case procedure. Periodic file reviews, half-hearted checks on old tips, and an occasional call to Laura with nothing new to say. By now, she had learned not to wait for those calls. Her own search had taken her across state lines and down long stretches of highway. But lately, the roads felt as empty as the answers. She needed another way to look. That was when she discovered Google Maps Street View could take her into towns she had never set foot in, letting her scan parking lots and sidewalks without leaving her desk. It started as curiosity, a way to retrace the trucking route she'd been following, but it quickly became something else. A new hunt, one she could wage every night without spending a dime on gas. Laura began methodically working her way through the route, town by town. She would drop the little yellow icon onto a highway exit and follow it into the heart of a small community, clicking forward, frame by frame. She zoomed in on motel parking lots, squinting at clusters of cars to see if any matched the vague descriptions she had collected over the years. She studied convenience store entrances, searching for anyone who might resemble Emma, someone walking past, someone sitting on a curb, someone standing in the shadow of a doorway. Even blurred faces were worth pausing on. Sometimes she would lean so close to the screen her eyes ached, trying to see beyond the pixelation. It became her nightly ritual. After dinner, she would settle into her chair, open the laptop, and lose herself in the virtual streets. The monotony was its own kind of comfort, a quiet routine where she could believe that with enough patience, she might stumble across the one image that would change everything. She began to memorize the quirks of the software, how the angle of sunlight could change between image captures, how vehicles could vanish from one frame to the next, how some streets hadn't been updated in years. Each quirk was a reminder that she was combing through fragments of frozen time, hoping her daughter might be hidden in one of them. Weeks turned into months. Laura scrolled past diners with peeling signs, tire shops with rusting awnings, bus stops where lone figures stood waiting in the midday heat. She learned to read the small clues in the background. A license plate hinting at a state line, a billboard pointing to the next town over, a building style that placed the image somewhere farther south than she'd thought. She told herself that technology was impartial, that somewhere out there, a Street View car might have driven past the exact place Emma had been, capturing her not for law enforcement, but for anyone who cared enough to look. But the longer she searched, the more the process began to feel endless. Thousands of images scrolled past under the quiet hum of her laptop. Sometimes she'd wake in the middle of the night and return to the screen, convinced she had missed something. On more than one occasion, she thought she saw a girl with Emma's build, a flash of a hoodie, a tilt of the head, but each time the details dissolved under closer scrutiny. Still, she kept going, because quitting meant accepting that the streets might always stay empty. Then, one evening, in the middle of another long, unremarkable stretch, she dropped the cursor into a small industrial town she didn't recognize. She followed a narrow street past a row of cracked sidewalks and boarded-up storefronts. It was the kind of street she might have skipped over if not for a faded corner store sign that caught her eye. She clicked forward and froze. Outside the store, partially in shadow, stood a man in a dark jacket and baseball cap. Beside him, angled slightly toward the street, was a young girl. Her face was blurred by the software's privacy filter, but her posture, her stance, the way her hair fell against her hoodie, it all sent a shock through Laura's chest. She leaned in until the screen filled her vision. The hoodie was maroon. The height, the build, even the way the girl's hands were tucked into her sleeves. It was all too familiar. The rational part of her mind whispered that it could be anyone, but the rest of her refused to listen. After 2 years of searching, Laura felt the pull of something she hadn't let herself feel in months, the quiet, dangerous rush of possibility. Laura sat perfectly still, her fingers hovering above the mouse, the image on the screen holding her in place like a trap. She'd been drifting through another unremarkable series of streets, her eyes glazed from hours of scanning when the frame appeared, ordinary at first glance, just a corner store on a cracked stretch of sidewalk. But in the next instant, her attention locked on 2 figures near the entrance. The man stood closest to the door, his head slightly lowered beneath the brim of a dark baseball cap, a jacket zipped to his throat. Beside him, angled toward the street, was a young girl. Her face, like all faces on Google Street View, had been blurred into anonymity, but Laura's breath caught in her chest. It wasn't just the maroon hoodie. It was the way the girl's arms hung loosely at her sides, the slope of her shoulders, the faint curve in her stance. It was a shape Laura had known for 14 years. She forced herself to look away from the hoodie, from the blurred features, and instead examined every inch of the frame. The girl's hair was parted in the same way Emma used to wear it, long and loose with a subtle wave near the ends. The proportions were right, the height in relation to the man beside her nearly identical to how Emma had looked the day she disappeared. In the girl's left hand, just visible at the edge of the frame, was what might have been a water bottle, or maybe something else. Laura's mind raced through possibilities, trying to reconcile the impossible. Her daughter, standing on a street corner 2 years after vanishing, captured by chance in a frozen moment of time. Her hands trembled so violently she nearly missed the screenshot shortcut. She pressed it again and again, saving the image from every possible zoom level, afraid the picture might vanish or update without warning. In the top corner of the store's faded sign, a few letters were visible, enough to give her a starting point. She leaned forward, adjusting the angle on the screen until the distortion softened just enough to make them out. A single word. It was distinctive, not the kind of name that could belong to dozens of stores. Laura's mind shifted instantly from shock to action. She opened another tab, typed the name into a search engine, and narrowed the results by location. Within minutes, she had found it. A small convenience store in a forgotten industrial strip of a town hundreds of miles away. The Street View date was stamped just 6 months earlier, recent enough to send her pulse surging. She called the detective still nominally assigned to Emma's case, forcing her voice to stay level as she explained what she had found. She sent the screenshots, the coordinates, and the store's exact address. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind that told her the weight of her words was sinking in. The detective promised to contact local law enforcement immediately. While she waited, Laura returned to the image, scanning for any other clues. A dark vehicle was parked a few feet from the curb, partly cropped from the frame. She couldn't see the license plate, but the rear bumper had a distinctive dent, and the shape of the taillights hinted at an older model van. She zoomed in until the pixels broke apart, searching for anything, a sticker, a reflection that might tie it to the white panel van from the early investigation. Her phone rang again less than an hour later. The detective confirmed that officers from the local precinct had been dispatched to the store. Laura gripped the phone, holding her breath as she imagined them walking through that door, looking around, asking the clerk about the man and the girl. She pictured the officers spotting them inside, calling for backup, bringing her daughter home. But the reality was colder. By the time the officers arrived, the man and the girl were gone. The clerk remembered them vaguely. He said they had been in earlier that day. He thought maybe they bought drinks and some snacks. The man paid in cash. The girl didn't speak. He couldn't recall what direction they had gone when they left. Still, the officers did more than just take notes. They secured the store's interior surveillance footage and sent it back to Laura's detective. Hours later, she received a still frame taken from that footage, showing the girl in profile. The image was sharper than the one on Street View, but not enough to erase doubt entirely. The hair, the hoodie, the build, it was all right. And yet the face, even unobscured, seemed to hover in a space between recognition and uncertainty. For Laura, the ambiguity was unbearable. She enlarged the image, studying the angle of the jaw, the curve of the ear, the shape of the mouth. Every instinct screamed that it was Emma. The detective promised to have the image analyzed by experts, but Laura knew they would hedge their conclusions, calling it a possible match at best. And still, the details gnawed at her: the maroon hoodie after 2 years, the town's position along the same trucking corridor she had been tracing, the man's deliberate avoidance of the camera's gaze. The local police began canvassing nearby streets, showing the image to other shop owners and residents. One mechanic thought he had seen the van before, parked overnight behind an old warehouse. When officers checked, the lot was empty. No cameras, no witnesses. The trail had already cooled. Laura sat at her desk late into the night, the two images open side by side, the blurred figure from Google and the sharper one from the store's camera. She told herself she should be relieved, that this was proof her daughter might still be alive, but the hollow ache in her chest told her otherwise. Proof meant nothing without a location she could walk into, without arms she could wrap around the girl she had been searching for. And yet, she couldn't shake one thought. If the Google Street View car had passed by just seconds earlier or later, she might never have known this moment existed, which meant there might be other moments, other streets where Emma had been, captured quietly, accidentally, waiting for someone to find her. By the time local police arrived at the small corner store, the narrow street was quiet. The two figures Laura had seen in the Google Street View image were nowhere in sight. The officers stepped inside, the bell above the door giving a dull chime, and found the place empty except for 2 employees stocking shelves. When shown the still image, both nodded in recognition. They said the man had been in before, always with the same girl. She never spoke, not to the employees, not to other customers. The man did the talking, paid in cash, and kept their visits short. One detail stood out. He always drove a white panel van. Employees remembered seeing them just days earlier. They thought it was unusual, not because of the girl's behavior, but because they had never seen the pair in town outside of those brief store visits. When asked about the van, one of the clerks said it was older, maybe late 90s or early 2000s, with no windows in the back and a noticeable dent above the rear wheel on the driver's side. There were no logos or markings, nothing to suggest it belonged to a business. Detectives requested access to the store's interior surveillance system. The footage, grainy but serviceable, revealed the man and the girl entering. The man moved with purpose, heading straight for the coolers. The girl trailed half a step behind, her hands tucked into her sleeves. As they approached the counter, the man kept his head angled down, obscuring his face from the overhead camera. But in one fleeting moment, as the girl turned slightly toward the display of snacks, the camera caught her face. It was only for a second, and the resolution was low, but it was enough. The image was sent to Laura that evening. The moment she saw it, her breath caught. The shape of the nose, the way the hair framed the cheek, the small mole just visible near the jawline. She didn't need analysis or probabilities. In her mind, it was Emma. 2 years older, slightly thinner, but unmistakably her. She printed the still frame and taped it above her desk. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't chasing a ghost. The confirmation sparked an immediate escalation. Authorities issued an alert to law enforcement across multiple states, detailing the van's description and the possibility that the occupants were involved in a long-term abduction. Notices were sent to truck stops, rest areas, and border checkpoints, instructing staff and officers to be on the lookout for the vehicle. Patrol cars were briefed to stop and check any matching van on site. Detectives also tapped into highway surveillance networks, pulling footage from toll booths and traffic cameras along major routes leading out of the industrial town. A few possible matches surfaced: white vans passing through late at night, taillights disappearing into the dark. But none yielded a clear license plate. The leads were tantalizing but incomplete, and every hour that passed made them colder. As the days turned into a week, frustration began to mount. The man and the girl had vanished as suddenly as they'd appeared. Local officers checked motels, knocking on doors and showing the still image to clerks, but most said they hadn't seen them. A few thought they recognized the van, but their accounts conflicted. One claimed it headed east on the highway. Another insisted it had turned south toward the state line. The lack of consistency made it impossible to lock down a direction of travel. Behind closed doors, investigators began to entertain a grim possibility that the case had moved beyond the reach of typical missing person protocols. Theories circulated about transient abductions. Victims moved frequently from place to place to avoid detection. Others suggested the girl could be caught up in a more organized network, one skilled at erasing trails and blending into the constant churn of interstate travel. For Laura, the sudden rush of activity was both a lifeline and a torment. Every phone call from the detective made her heart race, hoping for news of her recovery, only to hear that the van had slipped through another checkpoint or that a sighting had been disproven. She learned to track highway traffic reports, weather patterns, and even way station logs, looking for anything that could slow or trap a vehicle matching the description. Meanwhile, the store clerk who had given the most detailed account of the man recalled one last thing. On their last visit, the man had purchased a road atlas, an outdated paperback one, the kind truckers sometimes keep in their cabs. When pressed, the clerk couldn't say if it meant anything. But to Laura, it was another detail that made the image sharper. This was someone who lived on the move, who planned routes that didn't always rely on GPS, someone who could vanish into the gaps between surveillance cameras. Each night, Laura found herself staring at the still image from the store footage. She would trace the outline of the girl's face with her finger, memorizing it all over again, as if doing so might anchor Emma in one place long enough to be found. But the reality was impossible to ignore. The van had become another ghost on the highway, one more vehicle swallowed by the endless network of roads. The manhunt officially remained active, but privately, detectives admitted that without a license plate or a fixed location, they were running on luck. Laura refused to let the momentum die. She posted the still image to every missing person forum she knew, sent it to advocacy groups, and asked truckers along her mapped route to keep watch. But even as she widened the search, the fear gnawed at her. The next time she saw her daughter's face might not be in person. It might be in another photograph captured by chance, proof that she was still out there, but still just beyond reach. The weeks following the discovery of the Google Maps image were a blur of activity. Detectives worked the case like it was new again, calling in favors from other jurisdictions, passing out the still frame from the store's surveillance, and feeding every shred of information about the white panel van into national databases. Laura was pulled into the flurry of movement, spending her days on the phone with investigators, reporters, and volunteer groups, trying to keep the pressure alive. For the first time in 2 years, she felt the kind of restless momentum that had been missing from the search, the sense that if they could just push a little harder, turn over the right stone, Emma might be within reach. But the leads that came in, even in those first few frantic days, followed a familiar pattern. A van matching the description spotted outside a rest stop, gone by the time officers arrived. A man and girl fitting the pair's general build seen walking into a diner, confirmed to be a local father and his niece. Each time, the rush of hope was followed by the familiar weight of disappointment. The distance between sightings stretched longer, the descriptions grew hazier, and the tips that once carried the sharp edge of possibility started to feel like smoke. The man and the girl from the image were never located. Somewhere along the endless web of highways, they had slipped away, their movements once again invisible. Without a license plate, a definitive ID, or a precise last known location, the search reverted to the same obstacles that had plagued it from the start. Technology had handed them a snapshot, a fraction of a second in time, but it could not say what happened before or after. For Laura, the image became something she could neither let go of nor fully bear to look at. It hung on her wall above the corkboard of maps and timelines, printed in multiple sizes, each copy a little more worn from the number of times she had handled it. Sometimes she would stand in front of it for hours, her mind turning in circles around the same questions. Where had Emma been headed? Was the man holding her captive, or was there a more complicated truth she hadn't considered? Did the blurred figure in the street view image know that the camera had passed by, or had it been just another anonymous moment in an unremarkable day? The case remained officially open. Once a month, the detective still assigned to it would call, running through the checklist of whether Laura had heard anything new, reminding her that the department hadn't given up. But without fresh leads, the conversation always ended in the same polite stalling. For the public, the story had faded into the background, replaced by newer headlines. In police archives, it was another unsolved file with a small pile of loose ends, worth keeping an eye on, but no longer a priority. For Laura, that wasn't an option. The Google Maps image was proof, at least to her, that Emma's story wasn't over. She still woke before sunrise some mornings and drove the stretches of road that had become second nature to her. Long ribbons of asphalt flanked by open fields, winding routes through small towns where truck stops sat like islands of light in the dark. She would slow near motels, scan the faces of people walking into convenience stores, glance into passing vehicles at red lights. Every time she caught sight of a girl about Emma's age, her chest would tighten in that half second before her mind could confirm it wasn't her. The highways became a kind of purgatory. Too many possibilities, not enough answers. She learned the quirks of certain towns, where the van might blend in among work trucks or be noticed as out of place. She kept a thermos of coffee in the passenger seat, maps folded on the dashboard, a notebook ready for any detail that might matter later. She told herself she was being systematic, but in truth, much of it was driven by instinct, by the irrational pull of a road she had driven 100 times but felt she should drive again. Sometimes she would park along the shoulder and just watch the traffic. She imagined Emma sitting in one of those passing vehicles, maybe looking out the window without knowing how close she was to home. The thought was both unbearable and necessary. It kept her searching. The hope was dangerous, but the alternative was worse. Without it, the nights became heavier, the silence in the house almost hostile. She found herself lingering on the edge of online communities again, scanning for chatter that matched what she knew. White panel van, older model, man in a baseball cap, girl in a maroon hoodie. Most of the time, it led nowhere, just noise from people who wanted to feel like part of the story. But every once in a while, there was a tip that felt different, and she would chase it until she was sure it was another dead end. Over time, the edges of the image in her mind became sharper than the real one on her wall. She could recall every detail without looking: the chipped paint on the store's doorframe, the angle of the sunlight on the pavement, the way the girl's hair shifted against her hoodie. It became a kind of anchor, proof that Emma had been somewhere, that she had walked down a real street in a real town long after everyone else had assumed she was gone. 2 years, and one image. That was all she had. Enough to know her daughter might still be alive, but not enough to bring her home. It was the kind of truth that didn't let her rest, that sent her back out onto the road again and again, scanning faces, replaying the same questions. Somewhere out there, she told herself, Emma was still moving through the world, maybe down another street, maybe captured again by another camera without even knowing it. Laura kept driving those back roads, the map in her head expanding with each trip. She looked at strangers a second too long, memorized faces she might never see again, and carried the unshakable belief that one day she would turn a corner and the search would be over. Not because she had given up, but because Emma would be there, standing in the open, as real as she had been the last time Laura saw her walk toward the school doors. Until then, the image remained both a comfort and a torment, a frozen second in time that refused to answer the only question that mattered. Where was she now?